Margaret Walker had spent 40 years building a life that people respected but rarely understood. In Chicago's business circles, her name carried weight. She was known for solving problems no one else could untangle. Logistics networks, stalled supply chains, failing distribution systems. Companies called Margaret when millions of dollars were on the line, and no one else could fix the mess. She had started her consulting firm decades earlier with almost nothing. Just a small office above a hardware store, a second-hand computer, and the stubborn belief that discipline could replace luck. Her husband Daniel had been her partner in those early years, a calm and thoughtful engineer who balanced Margaret's relentless drive. When he died unexpectedly from a heart attack, most people assumed the company would collapse within months. Competitors circled quietly. Clients waited to see if she would falter. Margaret never gave them the chance. She worked through grief the only way she knew how, by turning pain into motion. Contracts were renegotiated, new partnerships formed, and the company not only survived but grew stronger than before. People admired her resilience. Few noticed the cost. At home, she raised 3 children, Allison, David, and Caleb. They grew up watching their mother move through life like a strategist on a chessboard. Problems were puzzles. Obstacles were simply delays. Margaret believed deeply in providing security. She paid for the best schools, the safest neighborhoods, the strongest opportunities. Whenever trouble appeared in her children's lives, she solved it quickly and efficiently. Tuition payments, unexpected bills, small business investments, legal consultations. Margaret handled everything before the stress could even reach them. At the time, it felt like love. She believed protection was the purest form of care. Years passed, and the children grew into adults whose lives reflected the environment they had been raised in. Allison married into wealth and moved into a gated community outside Scottsdale, Arizona. Her days revolved around social events, charity boards, and carefully curated friendships. She understood status the way an architect understands structure. Every detail had its place. David became a corporate consultant in Boston, a man who spoke in calm, measured sentences that made investors trust him instantly. Efficiency defined everything he did, including relationships. Then there was Caleb, the youngest. Caleb surprised everyone by choosing a different path entirely. He became a youth mentor at a community center in Denver. His salary was modest, his car old, and his apartment small. Family gatherings sometimes carried an unspoken tension around him. Compared to his siblings, Caleb seemed to exist outside the definition of success Margaret had quietly built around the family. For many years, Margaret did not question any of this. Her business flourished, her investments multiplied, and her children appeared comfortable and stable. That seemed like proof she had done her job correctly. But one autumn evening, something small disrupted that certainty. The disruption came in the form of 3 phone calls. Allison called first, speaking quickly about an opportunity to buy into a boutique wellness company. She explained the numbers confidently, but ended the conversation with a familiar sentence, "I just need some help getting started." David called 2 hours later. His tone was controlled and professional even though he was speaking to his mother. He explained that a career transition required temporary liquidity. A short-term loan would smooth the situation. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Later that night, Caleb called. He didn't ask for anything. He talked about a teenager at the center who had finally trusted him enough to talk about problems at home. Then he asked Margaret a simple question. "Have you eaten dinner yet?" The contrast lingered in Margaret's mind long after the calls ended. Sitting alone in her downtown apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, she began reviewing years of financial transfers to her children. The totals were enormous, but the numbers themselves weren't what unsettled her. It was the pattern. 2 children reached for her when they needed resources. One reached for her because she was their mother. That realization did not explode into her mind dramatically. It unfolded slowly, like fog lifting from water. Margaret imagined a future she had never allowed herself to consider. What would happen if her money disappeared? What if the power she used to solve every problem simply vanished? Would her children still recognize her place in their lives? Or had she unknowingly trained them to value the solutions she provided more than the person providing them? The thought disturbed her enough that she could not sleep. By morning, she had made a decision so unusual that it frightened even her. Margaret Walker was going to disappear from her own life. Not forever. Just long enough to see who her children really were without the protection of wealth and reputation. The only person she informed was her longtime attorney, Richard Coleman. Richard had managed her legal affairs for nearly 20 years. When Margaret explained her plan during a quiet meeting in his office, he watched her carefully before responding. "You understand that experiments involving family rarely end the way people expect," he said. Margaret nodded slowly. "I believe the truth already exists," she replied. "I just need to see it clearly." Within 2 days, she began dismantling the visible structure of her life. Authority over the company temporarily shifted to Richard. Major accounts were locked behind layers of legal control. Margaret left her primary phone on her kitchen counter and packed only a small travel bag. Instead of designer coats and polished shoes, she visited a thrift store on the south side of the city and bought clothes that looked worn and forgettable. When she finally walked out of her apartment building early one cold morning, she felt strangely anonymous. The first night, she slept in her car parked along a quiet industrial street. The cold crept through the windows and settled into her bones faster than she expected. Every passing set of headlights made her sit upright in nervous alertness. Margaret had spent decades operating in rooms where people treated her with automatic respect. Without that invisible shield, the world felt unpredictable. The second day, she walked through neighborhoods where no one recognized her. People passed without making eye contact. A store clerk watched her suspiciously when she lingered near the coffee machine too long. The invisibility unsettled her. By evening, exhaustion replaced curiosity. She found herself sitting on a bench outside a train station, eating a sandwich that tasted like cardboard simply because it was cheap. A man sat down beside her briefly and offered half of his thermos of coffee. He studied her face quietly before speaking. "You look like someone who used to have a different life," he said. Margaret asked him what he meant. The man shrugged. "Sometimes people go searching for answers they don't actually want." Then he left before she could ask anything else. 3 days later, Margaret stood several blocks away from Allison's gated community in Arizona. The winter air there felt dry and distant compared to Chicago. She walked slowly toward the entrance gate, her oversized coat hanging awkwardly from her shoulders. Her heart beat faster with every step. Allison's house sat deep inside the neighborhood behind a landscaped driveway Margaret had helped finance years earlier. When she pressed the intercom button, Allison's voice answered quickly, distracted and impatient. "Yes." Margaret hesitated before speaking. "Allison, it's your mother." The silence that followed stretched long enough to make hope feel fragile. Eventually, the gate opened slightly. Margaret walked up the driveway, noticing how perfect everything looked: fresh paint, trimmed hedges, expensive cars resting quietly in the garage. When Allison opened the front door, she didn't step outside. She simply stared. Her expression shifted from confusion to discomfort as she examined Margaret's worn clothes and tired posture. "Mom, what happened?" she asked. Margaret repeated the story she had rehearsed: the business collapse, the financial losses, the nights without shelter. Allison listened without interrupting, but something in her eyes changed as the explanation continued. Instead of concern, calculation appeared. She glanced behind her into the house, then back toward the street, as if measuring risk. "This isn't really a good time," Allison finally said, lowering her voice. "We have guests coming later." Margaret tried to keep her voice calm. She explained that she only needed a place to sleep for one night. The couch would be fine. Even the garage would work. Allison folded her arms slowly. Mom, you can't just show up like this, she said. People around here notice things. Margaret asked again, quietly. Allison shook her head. There are shelters that can help in situations like this. I can find you a number. The front door closed gently, but firmly. Margaret stood on the driveway longer than she meant to, staring at the house she had once helped fill with security. Eventually she turned and walked back toward the street. 2 days later she arrived at David's townhouse in Boston. The architecture was sleek and modern, glass and steel arranged in precise symmetry. David opened the door almost immediately when the bell rang. For a moment his expression showed genuine surprise. Then his professional instincts seemed to take over. He invited her inside but kept her near the entrance. Margaret told him the same story she had told Allison. David listened silently with his arms crossed. When she finished speaking, he reached into his wallet and counted several $100s. This should help you find a hotel for a few nights, he said. Margaret looked at the money without taking it. I don't need a hotel, she said softly. I just need somewhere safe to rest. David hesitated before answering. My work situation is delicate right now, he explained. People can misunderstand things. He pressed the money into her hand anyway and gently guided her back toward the door. By the time Margaret stepped onto the sidewalk again, winter wind cutting through her thin coat, she understood something she had spent years refusing to see. 2 doors had closed without hesitation. One remained, but now she wasn't sure she had the courage to knock on it. Margaret Walker delayed the trip to Denver longer than she originally planned. After leaving David's townhouse in Boston, she spent 2 restless nights driving across several states, stopping only when exhaustion forced her to rest. The money David had pressed into her hand remained folded in the inner pocket of her coat. She hadn't spent a single dollar of it. The bills felt less like help and more like evidence, proof of how efficiently compassion could be replaced by convenience. As the miles stretched across empty highways and quiet towns, Margaret replayed the encounters with Allison and David again and again in her mind. Neither interaction had been cruel in the traditional sense. No one had shouted. No one had insulted her. But the absence of warmth had been unmistakable. Their concern had been measured, careful, distant, as if they were managing a risk rather than responding to a mother in distress. By the time the Rocky Mountains appeared on the horizon, Margaret realized something unsettling. She was no longer afraid of rejection. She was afraid of confirmation. Caleb lived on the outskirts of Denver in a modest neighborhood where houses were built decades earlier and repaired slowly over time by the people who lived inside them. The streets were narrow, the yards uneven, and the sidewalks cracked in places where tree roots pushed upward from the soil. It was the kind of place Margaret rarely visited in her previous life. Not because she looked down on it, but because her schedule had always pulled her somewhere else. Important meetings, flights, conferences, there was always another obligation waiting. Now, standing at the corner of Caleb Street, she felt a strange hesitation. The porch light outside his house was glowing softly in the evening air. That single light made the small house look warmer than anything she had seen in days. Margaret stood there longer than she should have, staring at the door, wondering if this was the moment her entire experiment would collapse. Finally, she walked forward and knocked. The door opened almost instantly. Caleb stood there wearing a faded sweatshirt and holding a dish towel in one hand. When he saw her, his face changed in a way Margaret had not witnessed at the other houses. Shock appeared first, then confusion, and finally something deeper, something that looked very much like concern. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking slightly. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her before she could explain anything. Margaret stiffened for a moment, surprised by the sudden warmth of the gesture. Then her shoulders slowly relaxed as the reality of the moment settled over her. "You're freezing," Caleb said, pulling back slightly but keeping one hand on her arm. "Come inside." Behind him, another figure appeared in the hallway. It was Hannah, Caleb's wife. Margaret had met her only a handful of times over the years. Hannah worked as a nurse at a nearby clinic and had a quiet presence that people tended to underestimate. She took one look at Margaret's coat and tired expression before speaking. "Let's get you warm first," Hannah said gently. Within minutes, Margaret found herself sitting on a small couch in their living room. The space was simple but comfortable. A stack of books rested on a side table. A worn rug covered most of the floor. The smell of tomato soup drifted from the kitchen. Hannah placed a thick blanket around Margaret's shoulders while Caleb disappeared down the hallway and returned with a pair of clean socks. "What happened?" Caleb asked quietly. Margaret told them the story she had prepared. She explained that the business had collapsed after a series of disastrous contracts. Investors had pulled out. Legal complications had frozen her accounts. Within weeks, everything she built had fallen apart. She spoke carefully, watching their reactions as she described sleeping in her car and trying to figure out what to do next. Caleb didn't interrupt her once. When she finished, he ran a hand through his hair and looked toward Hannah for a moment. The two of them exchanged a silent glance that Margaret could not fully interpret. "You're staying here," Caleb said finally. Margaret shook her head slightly. "I can't do that," she replied. "You don't have the space." Hannah smiled softly. "We have space," she said. "It's just a small house," Margaret insisted. "I can sleep in the car again. I only came to see you." Caleb's expression hardened with gentle determination. "That's not happening," he said. "You're staying here." End of discussion. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat as Hannah guided her toward the bathroom so she could wash up. Warm water ran over Margaret's hands for the first time in days. When she returned to the kitchen, a bowl of soup waited on the table along with fresh bread and a cup of tea. The meal was simple, but Margaret realized she was hungrier than she had been in years. Caleb and Hannah sat across from her, talking casually about their day as if nothing unusual had happened. They discussed a teenager at the community center who had finally decided to apply for college. Hannah described a long shift at the clinic and a patient who refused to take his medication properly. No one mentioned money. Later that night, Hannah brought out extra blankets and pillows. Margaret tried to protest again, but Caleb shook his head. "You're taking the bedroom," he said. "Absolutely not," Margaret replied. Hannah laughed quietly. "You underestimate how comfortable the couch is," she said. Eventually, Margaret gave up arguing. She lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling while the quiet sounds of the house settled around her. From the living room, she could hear Caleb and Hannah speaking in low voices. At first, she couldn't understand what they were saying. Then fragments of their conversation reached her through the hallway. "We'll have to adjust the budget," Caleb whispered. "I know," Hannah replied. "The roof repairs might have to wait." "That's okay," Hannah said softly. "People matter more than roofs." Margaret closed her eyes as tears slid silently down the sides of her face. For years she had believed generosity meant providing financial stability. She had assumed love was something measured through protection and comfort. But listening to Caleb and Hannah quietly rearrange their lives without hesitation forced her to reconsider everything she thought she understood about kindness. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window as Margaret sat at the table with a cup of coffee. Caleb had already left for the community center, promising to return early in the afternoon. Hannah moved around the kitchen preparing for her shift at the clinic. After a few minutes, she sat down across from Margaret. "Can I ask you something?" Hannah said. Margaret nodded. "You don't look like someone who lost everything overnight," Hannah said calmly. Margaret felt her chest tighten slightly. "What makes you say that?" she asked. Hannah shrugged gently. "The way you carry yourself," she replied. People who experience sudden loss usually look confused or overwhelmed. You look thoughtful, like you're observing something. Margaret didn't answer. Hannah smiled faintly. Don't worry, she continued. Whatever the truth is, it doesn't change anything. You needed help, so you came here. Those words stayed with Margaret long after Hannah left for work. Later that afternoon, her emergency phone vibrated. Only one person had that number. Richard Coleman. When Margaret answered, his voice sounded unusually tense. Margaret, he said, we may have a problem. He explained that a short video had appeared on a private professional forum earlier that morning. The clip showed Margaret standing in David's entryway during their conversation in Boston. The camera angle suggested it had been recorded quietly on a phone. In the video, Margaret's worn coat and exhausted posture were clearly visible. David's voice could be heard explaining that he couldn't allow the situation to damage his professional reputation. David had originally posted the clip asking colleagues for advice on how to handle what he described as a potentially unstable family member. The problem was that someone in the forum had recognized Margaret Walker. Within hours, the video had spread far beyond the private group. Speculation exploded online. Some people questioned whether Margaret had secretly lost her company. Others mocked the situation openly. A few former competitors seemed almost delighted by the possibility that she had fallen from power. Margaret sat silently as Richard finished explaining the situation. What do you want to do? He asked. Margaret looked around the small kitchen. The sunlight on the table. The quiet house. The warmth she had felt here, without conditions. Then she spoke slowly. It's time, she said. But she understood something important now. The real confrontation had not even begun. The call with Richard Coleman ended quietly, but the silence that followed felt heavier than anything Margaret Walker had experienced during the past week. She sat at Caleb's small kitchen table staring at the blank wall across from her, her fingers resting lightly on the phone. Outside, the neighborhood moved through its normal rhythm, cars passing slowly, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the distant sound of children playing in a nearby yard. None of those sounds knew anything about the storm forming beneath the surface of her family. For the first time since she had started this strange experiment, Margaret realized that the situation was no longer fully under her control. The test had been meant to remain private, something she could observe quietly and reflect on later. But David's decision to record the moment had changed everything. What had been a personal question about family loyalty was now becoming a public story about failure, instability, and scandal. Margaret knew exactly how fast reputations could collapse. She had spent decades watching companies crumble because of rumors far less damaging than this. By the time Caleb returned home that afternoon, Margaret had already made a decision. He walked into the kitchen carrying a small grocery bag and immediately noticed the tension in the room. Something happened, he said. Margaret nodded slowly. She explained everything. The video, the online discussions, the possibility that people in the business world were already questioning her stability. Caleb listened carefully, leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. Unlike Allison and David, his reaction was not focused on reputation or consequences. Instead, he asked a different question. What do you want to do about it? Margaret looked at him thoughtfully. I'm going to tell the truth, she said. Caleb raised an eyebrow slightly. All of it. All of it, Margaret confirmed. Later that evening, Hannah returned home from the clinic and joined them at the table. When Margaret explained the situation again, Hannah listened quietly with the same calm attention she had shown the night before. When Margaret finished speaking, Hannah nodded once. Then they need to hear it from you directly, she said. Margaret looked at both of them before continuing. I've asked Richard to bring Allison and David here tomorrow, she explained. They don't know why. They just know it's important. Caleb exhaled slowly. That's going to be uncomfortable, he said. Margaret gave a faint smile. Yes, she replied. I think it needs to be. The next morning arrived cold and clear. Margaret woke early, long before the sun rose over the Denver skyline. She stood quietly at the kitchen window watching the street outside. For the first time since beginning this experiment, she felt a sense of calm rather than anxiety. The truth had already revealed itself. Now it simply needed to be acknowledged. By mid-morning, Richard Coleman arrived carrying a leather briefcase filled with documents. He greeted Margaret with a professional nod before glancing around the modest house. "This is where you've been hiding," he said. Margaret gestured toward the kitchen table. "It's where I found clarity," she replied. Richard placed several folders on the table. "Everything is ready," he said. "But once this conversation happens, there's no reversing it." Margaret understood what he meant. Inside those folders were revised estate documents, trust adjustments, and legal instructions that would permanently change how her wealth was distributed. She had spent the previous night reviewing every detail. Shortly after noon, a sleek silver SUV turned onto the street. Allison stepped out first. Even from the window, Margaret could see the tension in her posture. Allison's coat was elegant, her hair perfectly styled, but her movements carried a restless edge. She glanced around the neighborhood with visible discomfort before walking toward the house. A few minutes later, another car arrived. David stepped out carefully, adjusting his jacket as if preparing for a business meeting rather than a family conversation. Neither of them looked pleased to be there. Caleb opened the front door when they approached.
"Come in," he said.
Allison walked inside first, her eyes scanning the small living room with barely concealed confusion. "Why are we meeting here?" she asked immediately. David stepped in behind her, noticing Richard standing beside the kitchen table. His expression tightened slightly. "Mom," he said cautiously, "what's going on?" Margaret stood quietly near the window, wearing one of Hannah's sweaters and a pair of simple jeans. She no longer looked like the exhausted stranger who had appeared at their doors days earlier. Her posture was calm, her voice steady. "3 nights ago," she began, "I visited both of you." Allison blinked. "What are you talking about?" she asked quickly. Margaret continued. "I told you that my business had collapsed. I said I had nowhere to go. I asked for a place to stay." Allison's face paled slightly. "You didn't look like yourself," she said defensively. "Anyone would have been cautious." David remained silent. Margaret looked directly at him. "You recognized me," she said calmly. David's jaw tightened. "That situation was complicated," he replied. At that moment, Richard stepped forward. "For clarity," he said in his usual measured tone, "Margaret Walker never lost her business. Her finances were never in danger. This entire situation was a controlled experiment." Allison stared at him. "A what?" "A test," Margaret said quietly. The room fell silent. "You tested us?" Allison asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. "I tested whether you would recognize your mother without the protection of money," Margaret replied. David shook his head sharply. "That's manipulative," he said. Margaret did not raise her voice.
"No," she said.
It was honest. Richard placed a tablet on the table and pressed play. The video from David's house filled the screen. Margaret standing near the doorway. David's voice explaining that he couldn't risk damage to his professional reputation. The phone camera clearly visible in his hand. Allison slowly turned toward her brother. "You recorded her?" she asked. David looked uncomfortable, but didn't deny it. "I needed documentation," he said. "Documentation," Caleb repeated quietly from across the room. David's voice grew defensive. "If things escalated, I needed proof of what happened." Hannah, who had been standing quietly near the kitchen counter, finally spoke. "You mean proof that your mother became inconvenient?" The sentence hung in the air. Allison wiped her eyes quickly. "I was scared," she said. "People in my neighborhood would have talked." Margaret looked at her gently. "That's exactly the problem," she replied. Richard cleared his throat. "Originally, Margaret planned to remove both of you from her estate entirely," he said. Allison gasped. David finally looked genuinely alarmed. but she decided on a different solution. He opened one of the folders on the table. The inheritance is frozen, he continued, conditional upon several requirements. What requirements? David asked. Margaret answered.
Time.
Accountability. Real change. Allison nodded quickly.
We can do that, she said.
Margaret studied her daughter carefully. Change isn't proven in moments like this, she said. It's proven in the quiet months afterward. Then she turned toward Caleb and Hannah. Richard handed them another folder. Inside were documents outlining a new nonprofit initiative funded by Margaret's company. The program would provide counseling services and transitional support for families experiencing sudden financial collapse. Caleb and Hannah were listed as co-directors. Caleb stared at the papers in shock. Mom, this is too much, he said. Margaret shook her head gently. No, she replied. It's exactly enough. Across the room, Allison and David stood silently, realizing that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in their lives, money was no longer the center of the conversation.
Character was.
And that was a currency neither of them had ever truly learned how to earn. When Allison and David finally left Caleb's house that afternoon, the silence they left behind felt different from the silence that had existed before they arrived. Earlier, the quiet had carried tension, anticipation, the weight of something unresolved. Now it felt calmer, almost lighter, as if the truth had cleared space inside the room. Margaret stood near the window watching their cars disappear at the end of the street. She noticed how quickly they drove away, each vehicle turning in a different direction without hesitation. The separation felt symbolic in a way she couldn't fully explain. For years her children had shared a common center of gravity, her resources, her influence, the security she had carefully built around them. Now that center had shifted, and each of them would have to decide how to move forward without relying on the same foundation. Behind her, Caleb leaned against the kitchen counter with his arms folded, looking more exhausted than he had at any moment during the confrontation. Hannah moved quietly around the kitchen, gathering empty cups and placing them in the sink, though the dishes clearly could have waited. Finally, Caleb spoke. Did you expect it to go like that? Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. No, she admitted. What did you expect? Hannah asked gently. Margaret sat down at the small kitchen table before responding. The wooden surface beneath her hands felt worn but sturdy, a quiet reminder of the house that had offered her shelter when she needed it most. I expected anger, she said. I expected denial. What I didn't expect was how quickly fear would appear once the inheritance became uncertain. Caleb gave a faint, tired smile. Money has a way of clarifying priorities. Margaret nodded. That's exactly what this test revealed, she said. For the first time since the meeting ended, Richard Coleman closed his briefcase and prepared to leave. He had remained quiet after presenting the documents, observing the family interaction with the same careful professionalism he brought to every legal negotiation. Before walking toward the door, he turned back to Margaret. You handled that with more restraint than most people would, he said. Margaret smiled slightly. This was never about revenge, she replied. Richard nodded once.
Good, he said.
Because revenge rarely produces growth. With that, he stepped outside, leaving the three of them alone in the small house. That evening, Margaret stayed for dinner again. The meal was simple: pasta, vegetables, and fresh bread Hannah had picked up from a local bakery after work. The conversation was relaxed, drifting naturally from topic to topic. Caleb talked about one of the teenagers at the community center who had recently been accepted into a vocational program. Hannah described a patient at the clinic who had spent years avoiding treatment because he couldn't afford proper care. Margaret listened quietly, realizing how different these conversations felt compared to the ones she used to have at corporate dinners or business conferences. There were no strategies being negotiated, no financial projections being analyzed, no reputations being protected. Just people talking about other people. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, Margaret sat alone on the small porch outside the house. The Denver air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of pine from the distant mountains. Streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet road. She thought about everything that had happened during the past week. The cold nights in her car, the long drives between cities, the careful calculations she had watched unfold in Allison's eyes, the polite distance in David's voice, and finally, the warmth of Caleb opening the door without hesitation. For many years, Margaret had believed she understood the nature of success. She had measured it through stability, financial growth, and the ability to solve problems efficiently. Those metrics had guided nearly every decision she made while raising her children. Now she realized something uncomfortable. Success, as she had defined it, had been incomplete. Allison and David had learned the lessons she demonstrated every day. Protect your reputation, minimize risk, solve problems quickly, and never allow weakness to become visible. Those principles had helped them build impressive careers and comfortable lives. But they had also learned something else without realizing it. They had learned that vulnerability was dangerous, and that compassion could be postponed until it was convenient. Caleb had grown up under the same roof, hearing the same advice and witnessing the same patterns. Yet somehow he had chosen to interpret those lessons differently. Instead of seeing strength as control, he had seen it as responsibility. Instead of viewing people as problems to manage, he had viewed them as individuals worth protecting. Margaret still didn't fully understand how that difference had formed, but she was grateful it existed. The following morning, Margaret prepared to leave. Her company in Chicago still required attention, and the growing rumors circulating online would need to be addressed soon. The business world rarely allowed long periods of quiet reflection. Before she left, however, she sat down with Caleb and Hannah one more time at the kitchen table. The folder Richard had given them the day before remained unopened beside Caleb's coffee mug. "You haven't looked at it yet," Margaret said. Caleb shrugged slightly. "We wanted to wait until you were here," he explained. Margaret nodded. "Go ahead." Caleb opened the folder slowly. Inside were several documents outlining the structure of the new nonprofit program Margaret had described during the confrontation. The initiative would provide temporary housing, counseling services, and financial education for families facing sudden economic collapse, exactly the kind of crisis Margaret had pretended to experience during her test. As Caleb read through the pages, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "This is a full organization," he said quietly. Hannah leaned closer, scanning the documents. "There's enough funding here to run this for years," she added. Margaret folded her hands on the table. "That's the point," she said. Caleb looked up. "Why us?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Because you already understand the work." Hannah glanced at her thoughtfully. "You know we never helped you expecting anything in return," she said. "I know," Margaret replied. "That's exactly why I trust you with it." Caleb closed the folder slowly. "This will change a lot of lives," he said. Margaret smiled. "That's the goal." Later that afternoon, Margaret packed her small bag and walked toward the car she had been using during the past week. Caleb carried the bag for her while Hannah stood near the front door. Before getting into the car, Margaret turned back toward them. "For what it's worth," she said, "this week changed me too." Caleb raised an eyebrow.
How?
Margaret looked at the modest house behind them. "For years I believed I was protecting my family by removing every hardship before it could reach them," she explained. "But sometimes hardship teaches the lessons comfort never can." Hannah nodded slowly. "That's true." Margaret took a deep breath before continuing. "I didn't lose my family this week," she said. "I finally saw it clearly." Caleb stepped forward and hugged her again, the same instinctive gesture he had offered when she first arrived at the door. "Just promise one thing," he said. "What's that?" "Next time you want to visit," Caleb replied with a smile, "you can skip the disguise." Margaret laughed quietly for the first time in days. I think that's a reasonable request. She got into the car and started the engine. As she drove away from the small neighborhood, the mountains rising in the distance, Margaret realized something important. The test had never truly been about wealth or inheritance. It had been about something much simpler, about who opens the door when someone arrives with nothing, and who quietly closes it instead. The difference between those two actions, she now understood, defined the real meaning of family.